So we've got a massive new emergency showdown that is now heading back in front of the Supreme Court, and this could become one of the biggest election law battles in the country before this upcoming election cycle, because Alabama has now officially gone back to the Supreme Court and they're asking the court to immediately block a lower court ruling that just happened this week. That block from the lower court stopped the state of Alabama from using the Republican-backed congressional map in the upcoming election. But here's where things are getting even bigger. The Trump administration and the DOJ has now officially stepped in support of Alabama's side in front of the Supreme Court. So this is heating up really fast, a lot is developing, so let's break down what is now happening. Now before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button, that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now if you've been following along with some of the videos that I've done about this case, you will know that this entire fight really exploded after the Supreme Court's recent 6-3 ruling in a case called Louisiana versus Calais. That ruling significantly changed how federal courts are supposed to evaluate Voting Rights Act Section 2 claims involving congressional redistricting. Importantly, the Supreme Court emphasized that lower courts must separate race from politics and must account for legitimate political goals and traditional districting principles when evaluating congressional maps. After that ruling came down, Alabama immediately asked the Supreme Court to revisit the lower federal court's prior rulings, which blocked Alabama's 2023 congressional map, and the Supreme Court agreed initially to review that. The Supreme Court vacated the lower court's prior injunctions and remanded the case back down to the lower court for reconsideration under that new Calais ruling. That alone was a huge development in this case because Alabama immediately argued in the lower court that the Supreme Court's new ruling effectively validated its original 2023 map, and they requested that the lower court put in place that 2023 map and allow it to take place. But when this case got back in the hands of the lower court, the judges were not persuaded by Alabama's arguments. After emergency briefing and oral arguments that happened just last week, the three-judge panel then once again blocked Alabama from using the 2023 congressional map. Instead, the court ordered Alabama to continue using the court-ordered special master map that was already being used in the 2024 election, so it was used in 2024 and also in the recent 2026 primaries. But because of that new ruling that just happened in the lower court, Alabama once again has officially gone back to the United States Supreme Court on an emergency basis. And the arguments Alabama is making are significant. The state argues that the lower court completely ignored the Supreme Court's new Calais ruling and simply recycled the exact same reasoning that the Supreme Court had already vacated and remanded for reconsideration. So in essence, Alabama is arguing that the lower court ignored the Supreme Court and did not follow what they said. Alabama says that the district court is still improperly requiring the state to create a second majority black congressional district, even though Calais specifically warned lower courts against overriding legitimate political goals and race-neutral districting principles. The state of Alabama argues in this petition to the Supreme Court that the 2023 map was driven by partisan political considerations, protecting Republican voting strength in the state, preserving Gulf Coast communities of interest, and avoiding pairing incumbents. Now, Alabama also argues that the district court completely failed to follow the Supreme Court's instructions that courts must disentangle race and politics in these cases. But now we also have another development. So again, this is all happening very fast. And the new development also, along with the Supreme Court request for emergency review, is that the Trump DOJ has now officially filed an amicus brief in support of Alabama and their position. And the Trump DOJ is asking for the Supreme Court to immediately also block that lower court injunction. Again, that is a huge development because the federal government is now directly telling the Supreme Court that the lower court flouted the Supreme Court's own recent precedent in Calais. The DOJ argues that the lower court failed to properly separate race from partisan politics and that they improperly presumed racial discrimination simply because Alabama refused to create another black majority district. The DOJ also argues that the district court violated the Supreme Court's Purcell doctrine by changing election rules and congressional maps deep into the election cycle only months before the upcoming elections. And notably, the Trump DOJ here is openly characterizing the current map that was put in place by the court and that would be used if everything stays as it is right now as something that is improper, that is race-based, and also goes against Supreme Court precedent. Now, with all of this, one of the important things to understand is that this case is no longer just about Alabama. This case is rapidly becoming one of the defining Supreme Court fights over the future of the Voting Rights Act, race and politics in election, essentially judicial control over congressional maps, and how far lower courts can go in forcing states to draw race-focused districts. And politically, the stakes here are massive because congressional redistricting directly affects the balance of power in the House of Representatives. And control of this even impacts other things like federal legislation, committee control, oversight of agencies like the ATF and DOJ, judicial confirmations, and other broader constitutional fights involving things like the Second Amendment and other issues. So, of course, House seats are significant, and that's why this battle is heating up, and this is why this issue is once again back in front of the Supreme Court leading up to the upcoming election. Because of all of this, this case is now back in front of the Supreme Court once again on an emergency basis. Alabama is asking the Supreme Court to immediately stay this ruling, and essentially meaning that they want a temporary block from the lower court's ruling. And they also asked that the Supreme Court here allow Alabama to go back to the 2023 congressional map for these upcoming elections. So in practical terms, Alabama wants the Supreme Court to immediately stop that lower court order, restore Alabama's Republican-backed 2023 map for the upcoming elections, and potentially issue a broader ruling limiting how lower courts apply the Voting Rights Act after Calais. And so they want potentially a full review of this case if the Supreme Court wants. But in the immediate future, what they want is administrative stay on that lower court ruling and for Alabama to go to the Republican-backed 2023 map. So that is the latest major update in this Alabama election/redistricting battle. This case is now officially back before the United States Supreme Court on an emergency basis after the lower court ruled against the state of Alabama and that Republican-backed congressional map. And now the Trump DOJ has officially stepped in support of Alabama, and they're arguing that that lower court ruling needs to be struck down by the Supreme Court. This case, of course, is moving extremely fast right now, and honestly, there is now a very real possibility that the Supreme Court could once again issue a major emergency ruling impacting congressional maps in the elections, just within this week or so. Because also within this filing, Alabama and the Trump administration are asking for some sort of administrative stay at least by June 1st. So we should get a lot of new information in this week, and a lot of things will be moving very fast. So that's what's currently happening. This is back in front of the Supreme Court. The Trump DOJ has also stepped in support of Alabama. So now we're going to have to see what the Supreme Court decides to do. So as this develops more, as we get more information, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and don't forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.